Well, thank you, Corey, and good evening to you all out there. Thank you for being with us. Thank you also for your participation in the program. Your views are welcome. We live undeniably in uncertain times. I've argued two things from the outset of the mess we're in. This whole coronavirus debate has been dominated by alarmism, fear and hysteria, and that continues today. And it's affecting all of Australia. We're all locked off from one another. The second thing is the problem is not the virus, though any virus raises concerns. The problem government has is the response to the virus. One almost gets the impression that government is determined to test people to confirm their strategy. Obviously, if you test, some will test positive. That, to government, seems to justify, in their mind, lockdowns. Yesterday, in New South Wales, there were nearly 47,000 tests. All we get is cases. We're never told ages. We're never told whether they're mild or serious. But supposing in a big city you had an exam, all the kids had an exam in a big city, and you tested 47,000 kids and 116 failed. Would you turn the school upside down? Reported tests today, almost 50,000 in the last 24 hours. The new cases, 93. So of all the tests, 0.18% tested positive. Can anyone suggest to me that the response to such figures and the continuing alarmism is justified? But business, big business, instead of fighting this disproportionate response, are in bed with big pharma and big government and, yes, big media. Farmers are saying they might close Bunnings, Kmart, Target and Officeworks to limit the spread. What spread are we talking about? Sunday, 47,000 tests, 116 positive. Yesterday, 50,000 tests, 93 positive. So big business have joined the panic. A simple question. What did Farmers do in 2019? Today, we have in New South Wales, according to the official figures, 45 people in hospital and 18 in intensive care. In 2019, with the flu, and remember we had a vaccine for the flu, in 2019, there weren't 126 hospitalisations, as we have across Australia today. And remember, we don't know their ages, we don't know their comorbidities, but there are 126 in hospital. Australia-wide, 126, 20 in intensive care. In 2019, there were 3,915 hospitalisations from flu and 235 in intensive care. What were Farmers doing then, to say nothing of government? Did we have daily scare conferences, close down borders, smash business, terrify people with an advertisement? Were police stomping the streets, pole air above in 2019? In South Australia alone, in one day, there were 37 deaths. There were no daily press conferences, no breathless reporting of cases. People died from the flu. I repeat, in one day, South Australia, 37 deaths. The flu vaccine didn't prevent the death. But you've got Gladys Berejiklian saying today, in a disgraceful untruth, and I quote, "This Delta strain is a game changer. You can't compare the way we're treating it now compared with other strains." Well, I'm sorry. I've told you many times the lady can't be believed. I showed you the table from England last night, an official document, Technical Briefing 18. Have a look at the final column, the case fatality rate. Up at the top from Alpha, 1.9%. Further down on the right from Delta, the current strain, case fatality rate 0.2%. 0.2% puts the Delta strain on a par with the average flu season. In other words, the case fatality rate is 10 times lower for Delta than for the original strain. What is Berejiklian saying today? This Delta strain is a game changer. You can't compare the way we're treating it now compared with other strains. Do Berejiklian and Morrison know of this English official study? If our health bureaucrats don't know, they should be sacked. If they know but are not informing Berejiklian and Morrison, they should be sacked. And if Berejiklian and Morrison know about this but aren't telling us, they should be sacked. People are genuinely worried about deaths. Why aren't they told that in Australia for 18 months we've had 31,000 cases out of 25 million people? Cases. We've gone blind with testing, approximately 22 million tests, yet 0.14% of those tested have tested positive. 0.14% and 0.12% of the total population have tested positive. 0.12%. And the nation is tipped upside down. Why aren't we told in relation to the deaths, which quite rightly worry everybody, but 685 or 75% of the 912, 913 now it is, were aged care residents, almost all of them in Victoria, 75%. And that includes, I might add, people dying with other serious comorbidities. On these facts, the nation has been frightened into paralysis. A scare campaign and what I would call one of the greatest public administration scandals in this country. What do we get from all of this? A terrifying advertisement, which is nothing short of a disgrace. Someone breathing with difficulty, making loud noises and hooked up to a ventilator. An actress. A disgusting and desperate tactic. But as I say, beware of desperate people. And these people are politically desperate now. Desperate people are always defiant. The Australian public should be asking in relation to this ad, who is this woman on the ventilator gasping for air? We should know. How was she tracked down? How much was she paid? How false and misleading can you get? So now the campaign turns to vaccination. Instead of pressuring people to be vaccinated and targeting, threateningly, the people of Liverpool, Fairfield, Canterbury, Bankstown with dog squads, mounted police, highway patrol, Pol Air and the Police Transport Command, why don't Premier Berejiklian and Prime Minister Morrison explain why only 9.3% of Australians are fully vaccinated? Who's to blame for that? We're going to frighten, intimidate and terrify people because they won't vaccinate. Is it inconvenient to point out to government the principle of informed consent to medical treatment enshrined in the Nuremberg Code of 1947? We're a signatory. The code came into being as a result of the atrocities of World War II and the revolting medical experiments conducted by the Nazis and other totalitarian regimes against their own people in the name of science. This would be why the Australian Immunisation Handbook makes it clear that, quote, vaccines must be given voluntarily in the absence of undue pressure, coercion or manipulation, unquote. A resolution in January this year of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe argues, amongst other things, and I quote, even rapidly deployed, safe and effective vaccines are not an immediate panacea. The resolution argues, quote, vaccination is not mandatory and that, quote, no one should be politically, socially or otherwise pressured to get themselves vaccinated if they don't wish to do so. That's the Parliamentary Assembly of Europe. And, quote, no one must be discriminated against for not having been vaccinated, unquote. And in the Australian Immunisation Handbook, I repeat, vaccines must be given voluntarily in the absence of undue pressure, coercion or manipulation. One would have thought the repetitive fear-mongering and an appalling advertisement border on undue pressure, coercion and manipulation. Or have intelligent people noted the table I showed you last night from the investigation in England, Technical Briefing 18? I am not opposed to vaccination, but I'm vehemently opposed to being fed untruths and at best half-truths and not being told all the facts. Look at this table again. On the right-hand side are the unvaccinated. Note the figure, 71,932 of the 123,620, these are all Delta cases, unvaccinated. The death rate there, 92. That percentage is 0.13%. Go to the left on the chart and the heading is fewer than 21 days after the first dose, one death. More than 21 days after the first dose, come right on the column, 44 deaths. And on the received two doses, come further right, 118 deaths, total 163 deaths. Percentage of deaths, 1.08%. In other words, on that table, of those vaccinated against the Delta strain, 1.08% died, but unvaccinated 0.13%. The deaths were 8 times higher for the vaccinated than they were for the unvaccinated. They're official figures. Explain that. Tell the public that. And finally, if we're at 9.3% vaccinated and Berejiklian and Chant can't say we can't open up until we get 80% vaccinated, will someone tell us how that's resolved? Or do we say lockdown forever? It was Berejiklian who said on May 25, 7 weeks ago, and I quote, I fear for Victoria and I worry about what their government may do. We've demonstrated to other states that it's possible to manage an outbreak and not shut down a city. Unquote. Well, Gladys, be as good as your word. Or can't you be believed? It's boy in the wolf stuff. People won't believe you even when you are telling the truth. The young man I had on last night, Alex Baird, has set up a website, livewiththevirus.com.au. He's had thousands of responses, livewiththevirus.com.au. What all this confirms is one simple truth. The National Cabinet has failed abominably. We elected people to the federal parliament to make decisions on critical issues. They've been abandoned and replaced by a motley crew of left-wing premiers and bureaucrats who've used fear to shut out the voter and his or her elected representative. It hasn't worked. Berejiklian had better understand that in the New South Wales Parliament And at Liberal Party branches, there are leading ministers and senior members of the party who've had a gutful of Berejiklian and Chant making decisions. They've spoken to me. The fight back is on, even to the point of challenging the pre-selection of Liberals who support this current lunacy. It's no use paying coronavirus businesses in some kind of rescue package and saying the government will pay. The government has no money other than what it takes from us, the taxpayer. The New South Wales government has already splurged more than $3 billion on its coronavirus campaign. Federally, we're heading towards $1 trillion of debt. Government is giving nothing. It's our money to be paid for by our children, because government has blamed coronavirus when the problem is the government's over-the-top, fear-driven, extravagant, unaffordable, hysterical response. Well, here's the test, Prime Minister. If you're a true Liberal, you'll abandon the National Cabinet. You'll return to conservative values. You'll condemn the lockdowns for good. You'll make all vaccines and all treatments available. You'll issue all the available risk information to the public and let individuals, not ignorant, politicised and fear-mongering bureaucracy, make the decisions and call it advice. Prime Minister, what I'm advocating is the central tenet of true liberalism. It's called personal responsibility. What do you think? Email me, alan@skynews.com.au. The text line 0414 000 848. Well, look, I spoke to Rebecca Weiser a couple of weeks ago. Now, what she offers, which is not available in any of the political discussions about vaccination, is scholarship and research. We're now being fed the argument that the answer to everything is vaccination. But Israel is one of the most vaccinated nations on earth. Only 2 weeks ago, to the day, Israel announced their infection rate had taken off, whereas Lebanon, with lower rates of vaccination, was doing just as well as Israel. The vaccination argument is not straightforward. We need people like Rebecca Weiser in these times to do some homework for us. She's an outstanding journalist, but also a public policy and communications consultant, a first-class honours degree from the ANU, a graduate diploma in foreign affairs and trade. She's a contributor to the Australian newspaper and the outstanding Australian Spectator magazine. She wrote 3 weeks ago that in the United States, the official database for adverse reactions, which followed all the COVID vaccines, had registered almost 6,000 deaths in the first 5 months. She compared this with 2019, when there were only 605 deaths reported in the whole year, following all vaccines combined. So in the first 5 months of the COVID vaccines, 6,000 deaths. In the whole of 2019, pre-coronavirus, 605 for all vaccines combined. Reports of adverse events following vaccination, including deaths, do not, I have to tell you, necessarily mean that a vaccine caused the health problem. A review of available clinical information, including death certificates, autopsy and medical records, has not established a causal link to COVID-19 vaccines. But Rebecca Weiser made the very significant point, quote, adverse events on this scale have never before been seen in the more than 200 years since the first vaccine was invented. And this key point, which you don't hear from the scaremongering governments, writes Rebecca, these need to be properly investigated and explained. Of course, Rebecca Weiser joins me again. Rebecca, thank you for your time again. 9.3% of Australians fully vaccinated. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that's a combination of the supply that's available and a quite understandable level of vaccine hesitancy. And I think really what's important to understand is that vaccines can never be the whole part of a solution to an infectious disease. There's a big part of the equation that we've left out, which is called treatment. When you're sick, you need treatment. A vaccine is no good for you at that point. And that's really the biggest failure that we've seen so far in this pandemic. It's a failure to look at treatment.
Yeah, treatment. Look, but why aren't these disturbing figures you've quoted being explained to us by the government? I mean, 2 weeks ago, you quoted Dr. Tess Lawrie in the UK, world-class, evidence-based medical researcher and consultant to the World Health Organization. She's written to the British Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and she said the agency has more than enough evidence to declare COVID-19 vaccines unsafe for use in human beings. Now, I've got to say, the British health regulator has concluded that the benefits of the COVID-19 vaccines outweigh their known risks. And the CDC, Centre for Disease Control in the USA, says that COVID vaccines are safe and effective. So Rebecca, what are we to make of that?
Well, Alan, all I can say is that the news on the vaccine front has simply got worse. When we talked last time, a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote that article, there were over 6,000 deaths. Well, now there are over 9,000 deaths in the United States. And for all those people in Australia who imagine that Pfizer is so safe, most of those deaths have been after Pfizer vaccinations. Another very disturbing fact is that vaccine deaths and injuries often seem to occur in younger, healthier populations than they do in the older age group. So you get the exact opposite. On the one hand, the risk of COVID is concentrated very heavily in the older age group, people whose immune system is no longer strong or maybe have other illnesses that make them unable to fight off this particular virus. And yet, at the same time, a lot of the damage, the injury, and sadly death is occurring in young and healthy people. So there is a real problem here. Now, if this was all coincidental, Alan, and the TGA here in Australia and so forth, they start from the assumption, seemingly, that they're all safe. Everything is safe. Fine. Now we know that, of course, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia is caused by the vaccine. And we know that myocarditis and pericarditis are caused by the vaccine. But as we look at it, if these things were just coincidental, how come they go up in lockstep? How come the more vaccines you have, the more injuries you have and the more deaths? How come they all cluster around the same sorts of things, like blood clotting, for example, whether the blood clot is in the brain, whether the blood clot is in the lungs or whether it's in the spleen? You know, this is where we need the explanations.
I know. And why aren't we told this? That's all my point. I mean, 2 or 3 people have died. I mean, there have been 2 deaths, I think, in the last 48 hours from the virus, but there have been 318 deaths reported to the Therapeutic Goods Administration following vaccination. Now, we should say that the TGA say they're investigating the deaths, and you make the point. They make it clear that it considers most of them to be unrelated to the vaccine. But as you say, anyone who dies within 28 days of testing positive for COVID is listed as a COVID death, even if they were run over by a bus. But any death after a vaccine is coincidental. So just wrapping this up, Rebecca, what are you saying to people watching you tonight?
Well, Alan, you made the very good point that no experimental vaccine should ever be mandatory. People should not be coerced into this. And there are alternatives to protect yourself if you're a health worker. Dr. Thomas Borody and his team have been and are right at the moment dispensing ivermectin treatment. That is legal in Australia, what they are doing. That is known. And people in Sydney, the ones who know about it, are using it and are finding, you know, it's been shown to be very efficacious all around the world in studies. So I just want people to understand that it's not that frightening, that there are effective treatments out there, and that we really need to start recalibrating this.
And government's obligation is to make all that information available to us. That is all Rebecca and I are saying. Tell us all the truth, not the truth that suits you. Great to talk to you, Rebecca Weiser. I really appreciate your time. We will talk again soon. It's essential that we do. Thank you for being with us. All right, let's go to the beautiful, the gifted and the very popular Peter Credlin, a powerful and informed voice in today's difficult world. I want to talk to her about these news polls. Not that we should run government according to polls, but in this dictatorial world in which we live, how else do people express a view? Scott Morrison has suffered in the most recent poll, as you know, a 10-point slide in his approval rating. I don't think that is the real concern for the coalition. Labor, who've virtually been invisible, are ahead 51-49, but in Victoria, Labor ahead 53-47. In South Australia, it's 54 to Labor, 46 to the Coalition. In WA, it's 53-47 to Labor. The 18 to 34-year-olds are 63 to 37 Labor. The 35 to 49-year-olds are 54 to 46 Labor. The TAFE and technically educated cohort, and we spoke about these last week, are 53 to 47 Labor. University educated, 52 to 48 Labor. Languages at home other than English, 58 to 42 Labor. Full and part-time workers, 54 to 46 Labor. I think someone in Canberra had better wake up. The fundamental weakness of Morrison and Berejiklian, and their colleagues know this, they won't listen. And people are just sick of being dictated to. As I've said earlier, the National Cabinet's a failure. Our democratically elected representatives have been sidelined, and the decisions are now made by a motley crew of left-wing premiers and bureaucrats who've used fear to shut out the voter and those elected to represent us. Cabinet government is dead, and as I said earlier, Liberals are angry. An extraordinary but true story today that if the statewide swings in the latest news poll against the coalition were replicated at the next election, Albanese becomes Prime Minister. Well, no one knows this better than my good friend Peter, and she's with me. Peter, it's pretty serious stuff, isn't it, for many dedicated Liberals and people in business that by abandoning Liberal principles, the Federal Liberal Party could be handing government to Albanese?
Look, I think you're absolutely. Those numbers tell a story. They're consistent, so it's not just a poll in a certain pocket of Australia, and it's been a bit of a trend now for a couple of months. I don't tend to value published polls, poll by poll. I like to stand back and look at sort of where they're headed and the broader view. I think the government's struggling on the vaccine rollout. Now, I don't think they're gone. I don't think that this is necessarily a Labor win. I think it's a bit like, I'll say they're in the spare room. They're not yet headed for divorce. I think it all can come back. But I think the Prime Minister's got to do two things. One, he's got to resolve this vaccine rollout and get to a point where people have confidence that they've had the option of a jab, whether they've had it or not, and the country can start to reopen or the pathway to getting back on our feet. But importantly, elections are a contest, not a coronation. So what does the Liberal Party stand for? What are the policies they're taking to the next election? Beyond this pandemic, you don't win a fourth term by saying, look, I'm better than the other guy. I'm just a worse version of Labor. That's not going to win you a fourth term. So the coalition getting back to policies that make a difference in people's lives and sharpening the fight, the real contrast. You vote for them, you'll get that. You vote for me, you get this. Sharpen that up. That's what they need to take to the next election.
See, Peter, as you know, and we've talked about this before, there are two critical states, WA and Queensland. Mr Morrison's standing has slumped. Albanese currently has 68 seats in the federal parliament. He goes to the next election with a notional tally of 69 because of the creation of that new electorate of Hawke in Victoria at the expense of the Liberal seat in WA. So Albanese needs 7 seats. But if Labor holds only 6 out of 30 in Queensland currently, and on this poll, the swing against the coalition there's 5.4. In WA, it's 8.6. I'll tell you what, they're in trouble in Queensland and WA.